I'll give you the exact plan for how to learn fluent Spanish through part-time study by yourself. I'm worth listening to because I've achieved and gone beyond the B2 level of Spanish proficiency. And I've got the certificate from Instituto Cervantes from Madrid, Spain to prove it. I want to share a clear strategy for how you can get fluent too, and so that you don't waste your time making all the silly mistakes that I made. If you're new here, hola amigos! My name's Matthew. I used to work for Fluent forever and was mentored by the American polyglot and best-selling author Gabe Weiner. Since branching out on my own, I've realized that I just still love learning languages, and I've developed my own tools and techniques, and I'd love to share them to help you too. If this sounds interesting to you, then consider subscribing to this channel. Before I share my exact plan for part-time study, I want to share what my original strategy would have been versus how I plan out my language learning nowadays. So I don't know about how you would strategize or plan out your learning, but in the past, I had these ideas which I now don't agree with regarding what I should do. I used to think that language learning was like any other class or subject at school. I used to believe that traditional methods like textbook and classes would get me to fluency. All I needed to do was go through each of the classes one by one, from the beginner levels to the intermediate and advanced levels, and I would get fluent. Or I could just go through book 1, 2, and 3 for a textbook series, and I'd speak confidently and understand everything like a native speaker. But now, no way, I am not going to do this. I don't recommend this strategy for other language learners. I actually tried going through progressive levels of classes and textbooks to learn French and Tagalog and Mandarin Chinese. In all of those cases, I failed to get fluent. That experience of many years of failure with traditional approaches led me to think differently the next time when I wanted to learn Spanish. Sometimes life takes you on random journeys, and one day, a few years back, I found myself in Latin America, in Santiago, Chile, to be exact. I lived there for a number of years, as well as living in Cuenca, Ecuador. I also traveled and explored other Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, such as Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Panama. And while I loved that cultural experience, I had one major problem. I could not speak Spanish, but I needed it for my daily life and for my work. So it was a major hurdle that I had to overcome. But I was so busy with life. Hey, I had a full-time job. I had my relationships and social life. So I had to study it part-time. Now that brings me to a key principle that covers all of this part-time study plan. And this principle is the idea of solo language learning. If you want to learn fluent Spanish part-time because you're busy, you will need to take full responsibility of your language learning plan. And you're going to have to largely do it on your own. The reason I say this is because when you take control of your language learning and recognize that you can be an independent language learner, then you can take full advantage of the pockets of time throughout your day and week to improve your Spanish. A language teacher can't be the one to squeeze out all the time available in your calendar to learn a language. You have to be the one to do that. A textbook in Spanish can't be the one to get you to practice speaking fluently. You have to be the one to do it in your spare time. That's one of the key principles I learned and I took on board this time round when I wanted to learn Spanish, and it truly gave me great results because I was the one who was in control. I determined my plan and tailored it to my personal needs and circumstances. And that's what I believe will help you. Become a solo language learner, become independent, and take control and responsibility for your learning. Now, there are 4 main steps in the exact plan that I would recommend to you to get fluent Spanish. Step 1, start with the Spanish basics. Now, the overall goal in this step is to learn the foundations of Spanish so that you can reach a comfortable level where you can understand and be fine with working with native Spanish materials. It's hard to get into Spanish language books, movies, music, and websites when you first don't know the basics of Spanish. And so that's what this first step is all about. In this step, I would first begin with pronunciation. Start with learning the unique Spanish sounds. For example, you could learn the Spanish alphabet, where you learn the writing system, but also the very basics of how to pronounce each of the letters. You'd learn some of the nuances of the letters, such as the double L's, the y sound, as well as the double R sound, the r sound, and even the ñ sound, the ñ sound, which we don't have in English. You could also improve your Spanish pronunciation by learning the IPA, or International Phonetic Alphabet. Now, that's a standard way of writing out the sounds of a language, and you usually see the IPA in dictionaries where they've got those funny letters that spell out a word, and that's just a standardized way around the world for how to pronounce certain sounds. So you could consider the IPA to help with Spanish pronunciation too. There's also the idea of minimal pairs, where you could find different words in Spanish that look very similar but are different with just 1 or 2 letters, and that have a distinction between those sounds. For example, in Spanish, there's a minimal pair between caro, which is spelled C-A-R-O and means expensive, and that is paired with the other word carro, which has the double R, C-A-R-R-O, and that means car in Latin American Spanish. When you practice pronunciation with minimal pairs like this, you can then distinguish the differences in sound and help you improve your ears as well as improve the way you speak, because now you can actually hear those unique sounds. So I would start with pronunciation to begin with and not spend too much time on it, but having great Spanish pronunciation is important at the start so that you can build a better connection with native Spanish speakers, because they'll feel more familiar with you. And when you set that as your basis from the beginning, you'll then be able to extend those pronunciation rules to other words as you encounter them. Next, the other Spanish foundation you should learn are the words in Spanish. Now, your aim would be to grow your Spanish vocabulary, and one way to do this as a beginner Spanish learner is to use digital flashcards. Now, some other Spanish learners and linguists suggest that you could just go straight into Spanish native materials like kids' books and other basic Spanish materials. But there's also other research that suggests that using flashcards at the beginning can be a great way to solve that chicken and egg problem. The problem is that it's great to learn with these native Spanish materials, but it can be difficult to understand any of the words if you haven't learned them. There are studies which show that a vocabulary of around 1,000 to 2,000 Spanish words is a really great place to start and to get you at the A2 beginner Spanish level. But if you want to go even further to the B2 or even C1 level, then around 5,000 words is more recommended. When it comes to vocabulary, I strongly suggest that you study the most common words in Spanish. Prioritize those words because you're more likely to encounter them in dialogues with other native speakers, as well as in Spanish native materials and content. Then I'd go on to learning the grammar of Spanish, and I just spend some time learning the very basics, such as the different tenses, the genders, and also learn some of the basic phrases within Spanish. Now, all of this sounds a bit overwhelming to try and learn all of these basics. So I've made it quite easy for you by making Spanish flashcard decks with my favorite flashcard program, Anki. So check out the link in the description and you can learn more so that you can speed up the process of learning these Spanish basics. The second step in my recommended plan is to focus on input. Now, input means listening to Spanish and reading Spanish. So you're inputting all of that content into your brain and you are acquiring the language subconsciously as you input all of that. Because you've done the work of learning the Spanish basics in step 1, you'll find that you actually know a lot of the pronunciation, vocab, and grammar when you encounter them in Spanish native content. This makes it a lot easier, and if your goal is to be fluent in Spanish through talking and listening in conversations with others, then I would focus a lot more on getting listening input, because listening input will improve your ability to understand fast native Spanish speech, and it'll even give you examples of how you can speak fluently when you're ready. Within this input step, I would do a combination of intensive and extensive input. Intensive means going through and reading text or listening to audios, and then anytime I find any words or grammar points or pronunciation that I'm having trouble with, then I would seek out other resources to help me understand that new information. Extensive input activities, on the other hand, are just where you enjoy the language and you don't get caught up in trying to understand everything, but you just simply go with the flow of the content. So you treat the content as if it were in your native language and you just enjoy the subject matter. So if you enjoy sports or football and you listen or read content in Spanish about football, then you forget that you're actually learning Spanish and you just enjoy what's being said or what you read. My third step for fluent Spanish would be to practice output. Now, output means speaking and writing in Spanish. So you are outputting. And with this particular step, if your goal is really fluent spoken Spanish, then I would focus a lot of my time on the speaking aspect. Now, if you want to practice your speaking during part-time study, then of course you can hire a tutor or find a friend who's a native Spanish speaker and even do language exchanges. But I would also strongly suggest that you could do speaking practice activities on your own, such as the 4-3-2 timed speaking activity, such as the recorded speaking activity, and you could even practice the technique of shadowing. And I've actually got this other video where I go through all of these different speaking techniques for fluency in this video, which you can check out. The fourth step in my part-time study plan would be to live the language. Now that you've got the basics, you've been able to input Spanish and output Spanish, your next step would be to make sure you have the habits of a fluent Spanish speaker. So start thinking like a native Spanish speaker and think about the things that they would do in their life and try and take that on into your life. For a native Spanish speaker, they would be watching and interacting with native Spanish materials. So continue to read books in Spanish, continue to watch the news in Spanish, make friends in Spanish, join groups in Spanish, go to websites in Spanish. Try to integrate the language in your life and in your identity so that it really sticks and that you move from just becoming a Spanish learner and now you then transform into a Spanish speaker. Overall, with this exact plan, you could learn Spanish part-time But what you want to do is try and find all the different pockets of spare time throughout your day and week so that you can really make the most of the time you have available. But I would go through all of these steps one by one, and that gives you clarity and milestones for what you can achieve. And through that, you'll be able to achieve something like this, a certificate to show that you really are fluent in Spanish. And of course, buena suerte en tu viaje de aprendizaje de español.